Welcome to OSH After the Bell podcast, where we bring you a fun and informative conversation about everything outside school hours care and give a voice to our fellow educators. So buckle up.
Hi everyone, welcome to OSH After the Bell podcast with We Belong Education and with Barbi from Firefly HR. Welcome, Barbi.
Hello.
And today we have with us my really good friend, Angus Gorey, with us on the podcast. Welcome, Angus.
Thanks for having me. Nice to see you guys again.
Yeah.
It's been a while, actually.
Yes. I was just writing down how did I come to know about Angus and all the things Angus does. And Barbi and I both have known Angus from Camp Hill, his work in Camp Hill OSH. He's an educational leader in Camp Hill OSH, and you can learn a lot about amazing things Camp Hill OSH does from their Facebook page, Camp Hill OSH. Am I saying it right?
Yes, Camp Hill Outside School Hours Care is the Facebook page. Yeah,
Outside School Hours Care. Angus also has been involved in a lot of research and has done several publications. We will be writing about links to how to get to those when we actually publish this. So thank you, Angus, for doing all this research and sharing your knowledge with all of us, which is amazing. And then also, Angus is a co-founder of Outsiders Play Advocate, which runs professional development all across Australia. And as I was asking where, and Angus said, wherever kids play, we talk about play there. So welcome, Angus. And by the way, this is just the professional side of Angus. Angus is also a father and a husband and has a cat. Yes.
Yeah, that's a lot of detail.
That's a lot of detail. So welcome, Angus, to our OSH After the Bell podcast. We've been meaning to have Angus for a long time, but today we made it happen. So we are very excited, and thank you very much for being a part of this. Angus, you mentioned something about Outsiders Play Advocate and also your work in as an educational leader in Camp Hill OSH. And as the name suggests, you've been an advocate of play. Yeah. So in my experience, people have different definitions of play or how they view play, let's say.
Yeah.
How do you, let's say, if you were to talk about play to someone, how would you put it? What is play for you?
That's a really great question, Saurabh. And I think in the OSH industry as well, that can need a lot of contextualization because we have a framework and it's a leisure-based framework and play is part of that, but it's really easy to dress play up as leisure or rather leisure up as play, by over, documenting and prescribing activities, and they're very playful often, OSH programs, but they're not necessarily play as we would define it at Camp Hill or the Outsiders, and my own personal sort of outlook on play comes from a very play-work based background. And the definition of play used by a lot of play workers comes straight from the Playwork Principles, specifically Playwork Principle number 2, and would usually refer to play as freely chosen, personally directed, and intrinsically motivated. That's pretty all-encompassing because if it's not that, it's not play. So if it's an organised game with an umpire and a ref, it's an activity. And by the way, I'd like to point out there's not necessarily anything wrong with an activity, but it's just not play. And if we're, abiding by our Article 31 of the children's rights, then, we're obliged to provide leisure and play opportunities for children. And I think it's very clever in that article that those two words are used separately. So we shouldn't be getting them confused and using them as if they're the same word, like we do with a lot of words actually when it comes to children. Now that's our definition of play. I really don't want to sit on a high horse and say that's the definition of play. I think that would be very difficult actually for a lot of different reasons, because play is not very objective to the outlook, or it's very subjective to the person and what's actually going on in their head. I love, there's a quote by Gordon Sturrock, who's a very famous play worker, and if this is not verbatim, I apologize, but it will be close enough. And it's something along the lines of that trying to define play is like trying to define love, and you can't, because it's just too big for that. And I do like that idea. So obviously the Playwork principle number 2 gives us a little bit of a guideline, a little bit of a, a checklist there to maybe adhere to or aspire to, an ideal even. But, we'd never really want to pigeonhole play, because that happens, and it's dangerous to do that.
Mm. When you were mentioning the characteristics of play, sorry, Bobby, I think that you had a question there, and I interrupted
No,
you.
I just noticed both of us were writing that whole time.
Yeah.
Because it's something like play is a word everyone knows, and we think we've got an understanding of it, but then just looking at it with a different lens. And I haven't even, like, for the UN Convention, the Rights of the Child, I didn't even really take in the leisure and play purposely being 2 separate words. So I make sure I've written this all down too.
Yes.
I'm sure there's a lot of people listening too that didn't as well.
And
Yeah.
look, sorry, you go, Sarah.
No, yeah, go on, please. I'm listening.
I was just going to say, and I mean, that's only half of Playwork principle number 2 as well. And I mean, it usually doesn't get unpacked enough in the back end of the actual principle, but it also refers to the idea of children being in control of the content and intent of their play. And that's where it can get a little bit more challenging for, I was about to say educators, but educators are probably the most flexible in this space, but adults in general, when providing play and maybe needing to be aware that they've got to let go of control of the content and intent, that can scare people, to be honest with you. I'll use the word scare because adults like to be in control. Let's face it.
Yeah.
That's a thing. That's a real thing. And there's lots and lots of reasons for that. And some of them are very legitimate, and some of them are perceptive, and some of them shouldn't exist at all. But there are a lot of reasons for it. But yeah, to really meet that principle requires a lot of trust, and trust in the play process. And that requires more than an iceberg tip of knowledge, to be honest with you, and a journey for most people.
Seems that we have to work on ourselves a little more of letting go of that control and having trust on kids.
Yeah,
that's a hard bit. That's a hard bit, isn't it?
I like that you refer to it as working on ourselves. One of my colleagues, and I think both of you, I know Barbie's definitely met him, but Isaiah, otherwise known as Izzy, he fondly talks about his playwork journey as more of a self-help course than anything else. And obviously that self-help has led to his practice changing, and his practice changing for the better. But ultimately it comes from the play worker before it can manifest ever in practice in the play space.
Wow. When you were when you were explaining the 3 major characteristics of play, it was freely chosen, intrinsically motivated, and I forgot the third one.
Personally directed.
Personally directed. Okay. And these are the 3 things which forms play, and not the 3 things. There are other things, could be an element of it, but these things are there, and that's where, and I as I'm just listening to it, and I can see how some people would say, but we have organized baseball, and we have a critical reflection all ready to go. All we need is you with a photo of a baseball, and that is where I guess the control comes from. But as you said, that the control is for many reasons. It could be also that they want to look good, maybe, or look good enough in front of their managers to say, look, I can run this activity. And I really enjoyed listening to the fact that you've cleared play and activity as 2 different things. It's an activity versus play.
And the intrinsic motivation's a subtle point there, but I mean, it's worth unpacking, because there's not to say in a playwork setting like Camp Hill that there couldn't be an organized game of sport, and maybe that's an activity, but maybe not, because the intrinsic motivation of the child to partake in that, they might actually be seeking that structure in their play because they don't know the rules yet, or they feel safe because there's rules. It's predictable for that child in that moment, and that can be a comforting thing. So the intrinsic motivation to engage in that particular activity could make it play for that children. Now, if you sat all 30 of your children that you had in the afternoon down and said, you will be playing a game of baseball this afternoon, well, that would be a different scenario as well. So I guess in our programming, it's not that we don't offer those more structured pursuits for children, because there's a lot of different learning styles that children have, and a lot of different play drives that children have, and many of them do seek out the art lesson or the sports game that does have a referee. It's about providing the opportunity for them not to do that if they want to. Always having that ability for children to seek out their own intrinsic motivation, I guess. And it sounds a bit haphazard, but it ends up being a really amazing place to work with children, to be honest with you.
And it also says, sorry, it also says, sorry, it also says freely chosen. So when you say that we have these options for you and they say, oh, this one, I want to have this one, or because those options, organized activities, let's say, could simply be the prompts that, hey, look, we've got this sorted out for you. Do you want to be a part of that? And they say freely choosing it. That's the first thing you said.
Yeah.
And then sometimes motivation needs that little bit of prompt and go, oh, yeah, I can do that. Or I remember doing it last month and I enjoyed it.
And that's right. And look, a lot of people in our industry, once again, to go back to the frameworks, sometimes it concerns them. How can you meet the educational frameworks and reach the outcomes if you're not being more prescribed or prescriptive in your practice? But I would suggest that, I don't know how not to meet our framework now without doing this, because I want to go to words like agency and encouraging children to have agency in choosing their activities. I want to talk about the rights and dignity of the child, and that their rights and their dignity for me is about them being able to self-motivate themselves and direct themselves to what their actual interests are. Also, another one is, your reciprocal and respectful relationships with children. I think that can get misinterpreted a lot subjectively as to have a relationship with a child. I need to be sitting down with them, having a deep and meaningful conversation. That's a relationship. I think for particularly older children in school age care, respectful could be backing right off and understanding that those children need space and time and freedom to develop their other intrinsic motivations. And I don't think there's anything more respectful than trusting those children enough just to actually give them that space.
Sorry, Barbi, I'm going to let you speak this time.
Oh, no, I don't even remember what I was saying before. I have a 2-second memory and I think it's gotten worse. I don't even know what week of lockdown I'm in. Maybe 14, 15, I don't know. No, I think it was before, when we're talking about like the educators, can't remember the word you used, but I was going to say a bit of ego can get in the way, like especially, well, you're an educational leader, like from that perspective, if you've had a big involvement in the programming and then the children don't do that activity, it's kind of learning to let go of that's okay. They did activity and play, either or, and letting go of that side, I guess that ego side of our own. And like you linked back to the learning outcomes too, like even outcome ones, like children have a strong sense of identity. So I even think them having that choice not to do that and then being able to articulate that and that being okay and then being able to choose something else is like a great thing. Like you said, you're kind of already doing the outcomes without having to do anything, especially in this way. This is kind of embedded.
I like, I also like, sorry, Angus, you go.
I was going to say the ego word is a big one, and I 100% agree with you. And it's another element, an aspect of playwork philosophy that is it becomes a bit of a mantra. And I'm going to refer to the Playwork Principles again. And one of the Playwork Principles refers to the idea, and there's only 8 of them, by the way. So if you want to look them up, we can add that to the podcast notes maybe, because these are a really lovely list of ideals to aspire to. But there is one that refers to the idea that playworkers prioritize the play process over adult agendas. And ego, I hate to say it, is an adult agenda. It's purely and subjectively ours. It's not supporting the play process to have it. And we can really use that particular principle in relation to a lot of things when it comes to adults making decisions over what children are doing. But yeah, there's lots of different ways we can unpack that actually. So let's move on. Otherwise, we will be going down those tangent holes that we were talking about earlier.
I have to admit, I've opened up the 8 Playwork Principles. I really like them, but I haven't actually spent a lot of time or attention to them. I feel like they kind of go hand in hand with what we want to be doing, I guess, in out of school hours care, or for me personally, as when I was an educator, what I would want to be doing, what I'd want to see services doing. So we'll definitely put that link in there, and I kind of urge everyone to go check them out.
And I think anyone who is an advocate of children and children's voices, as Angus pointed out earlier, just cannot look beyond these these playwork practices. It's just so obvious. When you mention something about outcome achieving, but whose outcome? Whose outcomes are we achieving? Is it the adult's outcome that we want to achieve this, or is it children's outcome that, hey, what do you want to do? What motivates you today, or how do you feel like today? Because you could say soccer is very popular at my after school care. You can just say it, but that doesn't mean that every day every child would be interested in soccer. It could be a very different thing today in the afternoon. And then the ability to just listen and be present to children's voices, and that would be amazing. It's like people say, I want to listen to children's voices as long as they say what I want to hear. You know?
Yeah.
So it's not children's voices necessarily then.
And that is, I mean, yeah, adults do love to hear what they want to hear. I think that's, you know, there's a potentially vicious cycle with having a very outcomes focused approach. And as you know me well enough to know that we're not particularly outcomes focused. If we are going to link that to the framework, if that challenges any people in OSH, I'd say that if the principles and practices are delivered in the most authentic, holistic way possible, the outcomes are going to be happening more times than you can possibly record them. So we don't need to sweat that as much. But if we are focused on the outcomes, the largest risk I feel there is, once again, we're adults. It's not our fault, it's our brains. But by the time we are adults and our neuroplasticity has somewhat tapered off and solidified, we will see our subjective interpretation of what an outcome looks like. And when there's 5 to choose from, we'll have 5 particular ways in which we're expecting to see those things. And that's dangerous for a few reasons. First of all, it can allow us to very hard and fast put our agenda, our adult agenda, once again, not prioritizing play, but our adult agenda on the children to try to guide and manipulate them towards an outcome for the purpose of, you know, documenting and recording it and doing what we assume our job is. And secondly, it can, and I think this is almost sadder, it closes our eyes or our minds off to the many, many, many other amazing things that are happening in the space. It's almost like we've taken the 180-degree vision off and put our blinkers on, and that's what we're looking for from then on in that space. So prioritizing play itself, leaving yourself open, receptive. Playwork is a very, very deeply reflective practice, and reflection comes from a lot of observation. It's nice to know that there's never an end game, because you'll never know everything that's going on. And I think outcomes, once again, put you in a position where you're meant to see an end to something. Children's motivation in play, for it not to end. So there's a bit of a clash of ideals there between the adult agenda and the play agenda, if we're looking for its end. A play worker, on the other hand, would facilitate an environment where the play ideally would continue and evolve and diversify. And I can go on and on and on with different words, but I'm sure the point's been made.
Yeah, and I know there's services too and educators that get kind of stuck in that box checking. So with an outcome, they might check off, okay, children have a strong sense of identity from this one activity, and then move on. Instead of, like you mentioned before, say when I wrote down, when the principles and practices are done, they lead to the outcomes naturally being fulfilled.
Correct.
So I can imagine with your program, just with what you do, children with outcome 1, children have a strong sense of identity naturally, just because those options are available in there. I don't know if we go down this track too, but how you document, because I think for a lot of people, I was very different to how I document, but I know there's a lot of people out there that might have like a template.
Yeah.
I'm not sure what you use at Camp Hill, but what you find that works for you in your very, very play-based environment. I don't know if there's any tips that you might be able to give, or some insight.
I can definitely give some tips, and it's hard to give an answer because it really does need to be contextualized to your team's space and your team's current level of knowledge. And that's not a patronizing statement. Everyone's knowledge is always developing, including everyone in this podcast right now. But when I first started, there was a template, and that template did have the potential negative outcome of being a mandatory thing that you fill out. So you bash out the observation, you link it to the outcomes, and that's that. But it was limited in the sense that it did, once again, put the blinkers on into what you were seeing and how you were seeing it. To drop another amazing OSH's name, in an action research project several years ago now. QCAN supported Grand Avenue OSH, which is an OSH up here in Southeast Queensland. They did a action research project on effectively supporting staff in presenting the most meaningful documentation. I can't remember the exact name of the process, but the purpose was to support meaningful documentation. And they tried lots and lots of different techniques and methods of documenting. And a great outcome of action research when you haven't pre-decided the outcome that you're seeking. Once again, how about that? Research shouldn't be outcomes focused, should it? Because that's completely not the point. We need a hypothesis and to prove it or not. But Grand Avenue did get to the point that the best way that they found to get the most meaningful documentation from the most members of their staff was just to have the most options available. So some people would be great at writing paragraphs of deep and meaningful evidence base. Some people would draw pictures. Some people would be better on Facebook or digital methods. Some people would be better with a notepad. Some people you're better off just walking around to and having a conversation to them and writing that off as their documentation, because it's more meaningful probably than anything that they're going to do at 6:05 when they should be on their way home to their families. So we took a page from that book a long time ago and have been pretty committed to providing the most diverse ways in which staff can provide their thoughts, even getting away from words like observations and opening up a whole other plethora of meaningful words related to documentation, whether it's ideas, reflections, critical reflections. The difference, of course, being that a reflection is something you do by yourself. To make it critical, you need to take it to a group and bounce those ideas around. And we do a lot of that at Camp Hill, obviously, every day, actually, at our 2:30 meetings. But these have to work for your service as well. So I'm certainly not saying for everyone by Monday to have created 8 new documentation styles. For us as well, there's, once again, and I'm going to use the word a lot because it is my passion and my vocation, but Playwork comes with a lot of very, very interesting ways to diversify what those drawings and those scribblings can look like. And if nothing else, and the OSH industry is fairly unique in the sense that even in the early years, you have people that have done their certificates and diplomas of that particular field. And I think it's actually something to celebrate, that the average OSH has many, many people working towards many, many different disciplines. And I think that's amazing for the diversity of our staff and our ability to provide opportunities for a diverse range of children. But it can leave a lot of people speaking different languages, academically so. So Playwork in our service is the common language, regardless of what everyone else's field. If we refer to the play cycle and the setting or the return to a play cue, that's going to be understood, just like day-to-day conversations. So that's powerful as well. And I can go down the rabbit hole of Playwork documentation. There's a lot of different ways to do that, from critical cartography to identifying, forensic play work, and so on and so forth. We won't go, once again, that's could be a whole nother podcast. But these are interesting. They make documentation interesting, which is a challenge. I think every educational leader out there, I've heard articulate anyway, many of them. If you can actually make documentation something staff are actually compelled to do off their own back, I'm not saying that's easy in any setting, including ours, but you've got to have a go, because it doesn't need to be the sterile template-based process. And I'd suggest that if we're using the word meaningful in front of our word documentation, meaningful documentation, sometimes some documentation you see, it's almost why bother?
Yeah. And I asked that question too. So I was exactly the same. I came from a primary teaching background too. So as soon as I went into schoolhouse care, it's, outcomes. Okay, I know what to do with them. It is a bit of a tick boxing thing. And then developing from that, documentation for me was an A4 sheet. And it was basically, the activity was already picked for the day of what was going to be documented. I know this happens, and so this is why I asked you that question, because you digressed into what I think and feel as well. It's what suits you and your service and your educators. I myself, I'm dyslexic, so the whole writing paragraphs and everything, it will never work for me. So I was pretty mindful, although I know it was also hard for the half of my team that was very just opposite. I can't even think what's the opposite of a dyslexic person. Logical. Like I had someone studying biochemical engineering, very smart. And for us in adding to our quip, it was the same as you mentioned with documentation. It was how it suited you. So you could add something typed up, you could add a picture, you could add a mind map, you could add dot points. It was just to suit your, I want to say, learning style. For him, because he's very smart, he found that difficult, not having a set approach. And also he knew it was a legal document we had to have. So for him, his mind was just like, hang on, I just need to know how to do it, even though he had all these options. It didn't suit. So we were pretty mindful with that and with him and kind of supporting him and how he did that. Otherwise, it suited pretty much everyone at our service. And the same with documentation too. It wasn't meaningful when we were using that sheet, especially an activity already picked out for the day. How can we predict what we want to write about later? We don't even know. We don't.
I mean, the extreme end of that spectrum is I've seen documentation done by a particular service. Not the case anymore at all, but there's 5 outcomes. How many days of the week are there that children are GOSH? 5. So Monday became the Communicators Day. You know, Tuesday became the World Identity Day, and so on. So that's how trained and focused it had become. But once again, I go back to that idea of what else are you missing on those days, and potentially not providing for because of that fixation on that one outcome at a certain time in a certain place. And anyone that works with children or in education, psychology, whatever it may be, knows that that's not how children learn or behave. They're very, very diverse in where they're at. And I'd like to think that if nothing else, Playwork practice, it's grey, but very intentionally grey, because children are a big grey ball of interesting, and where they're at is so varied, particularly in those formative years. The difference between a 4 and a 5-year-old is just, huge.
And how you mentioned about those 3 characteristics of play, and I'm listening to you go on, talk about meaningful observations, and you mentioned how, even with Barbie, you mentioned how educators wanted to have options. Like it worked out for them to the research that we found out that they were okay. The observations when provided with options was better for them. And I'm like, isn't that what we want to give to kids as well? So when I look at the observation, I see, so adults like options, okay. Adults like a freely chosen way of doing observations, okay, and that gives them intrinsic motivation. But isn't that what we're saying to provide to the kids? Like
you've just applied some of your logic studies there, Saurubh.
I always say a lot of what we're talking about with kids is what we should be doing with our staff and educators as well. So
I listen to you and I hear how adults' logic versus kids' logic was something which I really like to talk about. And you mentioned about adults' agenda and how children are so different. But they're not that different necessarily when you actually look at the things you really enjoy. Let's have a look at things you enjoy. Did you choose it? Yes. Are you intrinsically motivated? Yes. Did somebody tell you in the morning to wake up to do that thing? No, you did it yourself. So yes, we are different, but at the same time, for some things, like this is exactly what we want to be that space where this can happen for children, options and intrinsic motivation and freely chosen.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, and there's a lot of evolutionary premise to why that is too. It's not made up stuff. Like, I mean, that's important to flag about any of this practice. It's not a niche movement. This has been decades and decades and decades in the making from a formative playwork theory and practice perspective. But the human mind, Homo sapiens, has been developing for tens and tens and tens of thousands of years.
Yep. Yes.
And it's not as simple as people just wanting neurology to change. It doesn't happen that way. There's a lot of hardwired stuff, and there's a lot of ways that we're programmed, for lack of a better word, or let's say innately drawn to learn and play and behave. Modern culture doesn't necessarily support that, particularly when we do get to outcomes-driven agendas, very one way or my way or the highway style approaches. You sort of 40,000 years ago, your average hunter-gatherer was a jack of all trades. They had to know how to collect down to fuel their fire, how to collect the flint to do that, understand that various fruits and vegetables, some were poisonous, some were not. Every single brain had to store an immense amount of information, every individual one. 10,000 years ago, we had the agricultural revolution, and that's seen by a lot of historians as this, huge leap in, human success, but only really if you measure human success in the number of humans. For a lot of other reasons, there was a lot of downsides to that. We went from having very, very diverse diets to often only subsiding on the rice or the potatoes that we grew, very limited diets. And our activities from the day went to being hugely multifarious, to being set on one crop or one season and being very fixed. Our growth mindset, for lack of a better word, got very, very constrained and limited. And that flowed into how, I think anyway, we provide play opportunities that are narrow and strict and guided towards an outcome, as opposed to letting it be what it is, which is this hugely diverse and dynamic and unpredictable creature, which is challenging but exciting, really, as well, for the practitioner as well as the child, if you let it be.
It's more to do with satisfying these expectations from the society during agricultural revolution, industrial revolution, that, hey, we need these many engineers, these many doctors, these many things to run society. And then we started saying, okay, if this is how, because coming from India as a child, there is no freely chosen play. I mean, there was in school arena, at least, outside school, we played with our cousins and friends, and we could do anything. And there was no supervision, which I'm really happy about. And as a child, I was able to do a lot of that, a lot of risky play and jumping off the terrace and all that kind of thing. John, follow my advice. We have a Playworker, please listen to him. Anyways, but this is what I did when I was a kid. But there wasn't, in the school, when I went to the school, it was an expectation that I should do certain things to then one day, someday become a contributing member to the society. When I was at home and I was playing outside, that was me choosing, or me or my friends choosing what we wanted to do. And I could see how this dichotomous expectation or perhaps ideology, that is the one way that you go, you should do these academics, you should do these, achieve these outcomes so that one day you become an engineer. But when they come to after school care or long day care, or even in schools as well, perhaps, we don't want another one of those. We don't want another set of rules that, hey, you do these so that you become good at throwing a ball. I mean, that's restricting. And you said the growth mindset then became like so fixated on achieving something rather than exploring and just being and enjoying the moment.
Absolutely, yeah. Children probably have less of those opportunities, and without getting preachy about that, less opportunity to just do what their biology, what their innate desires, once again, their intrinsic motivation. Let's go back to that. Very few opportunities, a lot less than there used to be. I don't want to come across as, back in the day. What a statement that is. But things change quickly, and once again, for lots of reasons. Not as many children walk home these days, and maybe that's a sensible thing, because there's a lot more cars on the road than there used to be, and they're a lot faster than they used to be as well. So there's other factors societally that have come into place that are also limiting, not just subjective agendas, but they all do have an effect. And I think OSH, above a lot of other settings, actually has this really unique capacity, if it is recognized and embraced, to provide quite possibly this space where children can really embrace their intrinsic motivation and do it in a freely directed and personally chosen way. And it actually is supported by the framework. We don't need to sweat that. We don't need to rebel against the institution, so to speak. The institution actually supports it. If we interpret the institution and the frameworks and the national quality standards in particular ways.
I was going to say, it's why I didn't go back to primary teaching. Like, I fell into OSH, and that's what I liked about it the most. Like, I wasn't a big fan of the curriculum in the classroom and the expectations, and then moving into out of school hours care, which I'd never heard of before till I fell into it. And I'm like, wow, this is such a different approach. This is actually why I got into teaching in the first place. And I know that's the same for many people. And like you said, it's wonderful that it's kind of already there to start with.
And Angus, you mentioned how the world is changing. We have faster cars. We have a few things that we really need to look at from the safety point of view, perhaps, for the children. But in the same changing world, I like how you said that OSH still has this perhaps an exclusive place to some extent where we can regenerate or allow those maybe I'm wrong in saying this, but primal instincts to be explored, to create that space where, yes, outside OSH we can go with the world, and it's changing quite rapidly actually, but in OSH we can go back and do what we used to do. But I believe that sorry, I believe that I have a question for this. Other than this ideology shift or philosophical shift that let go of the control and allow children to be in action, or to be the children-centered activities, what are the other challenges which you think are in the way of play, other than simply adults practicing their control just because they can and they are in the authority?
Yeah, very loaded question as well. And I think to go down one way to answer that, I think it is a lack of trust in play. And that's sad because we were all children at some point and we all did play. In fact, one of the most successful ways to bring stakeholders on board in our experience, whether it's working between an OSH and parents, whether it's working between an OSH and a school, whether it's working between school and their department and parents, there's many different faces that can take. But a very successful tactic is usually just to get people to reflect on their own childhoods and their own play experiences, and how that makes people, without even asking them to, they start getting a little crooked grin as they remember some crazy little bit of chaos that they remember as being a highlight of their childhood, and so on and so forth. But we grow out of that because we become responsible, let's put inverted commas around that, adults, and we are liable. Words like that are being used, and it makes people very nervous. The benefit is in play that a lot of the things that we're fearful of are perception. And it's not that they're misplaced perception. We do need to be careful, but we actually find that they're a bit paradoxical as well. And a lot of the things that we're scared of about the play, the antidote is actually in the play itself. And Sarah, I'll use this example because I could use one of many, but I'm going to bring it back to risky play only because you mentioned it with your childhood and you got to experience risky play.
Yeah.
And obviously, and I get it, I'm definitely not patronizing from a person in a position of responsibilities perspective. As soon as you even use the word risky play, you have to be careful. It elicits feelings and responsibilities that we can't ignore. And so two things on that. Firstly, I'm going to posit an idea that I'm pretty passionate about, and that's to remove the prefix from the word play. Play should come first. So really, it's play that has an element of risk involved. And that's important because usually when we say risky play, our brain goes straight to physical risk. Okay. That's the one that we always seem to want to manage. And if you read most schools, and OSHAs can be pretty good at this actually, but still we see it in our risk management forms. We largely focus on the physical risks. But from a risk point of view, there's also obviously social and emotional risk in play. And it's actually far more common than physical risk as children of different age groups are experimenting that. And that can be done very intrinsically, by the way. Children often test themselves in play and they put themselves on the precipice of emotions and feelings. And that's important because we need to have those skills as an adult. So the point of that little ramble is just to articulate that there's risk in all play. We don't have the ability as adults to say, I'm okay or I'm not okay with risky play. We don't have that choice. There's risk. We need to understand that. And if we understand that, we can facilitate it better. Secondly, though, you love it? Excellent.
Love it. Love the fact that there's risk in every play. I love the fact that you cannot say that, oh, this play has no risks at all. Hang on a sec. But there could be an emotional risk right now. There could be a social risk, which you haven't yet assessed. Love it.
Absolutely.
That's great. And, fantastic.
Well, you make a good point, Sarah, because once we pretend that we can actually call something risky play, that puts it in a category, a box that we can choose to program for or not. And that is dangerous, because if we don't choose to do that, we're living in this world where we've decided there's no risky play, and we're ignoring then that there's risk all the time that we should be aware of as play workers and deeply understand. The paradox here is, though, that risk in play or play that has elements of risk is a critical thing for children to be exposed to in controlled ways. And usually they actually do most of the controlling there, so it becomes less stressful. But if we're not providing those opportunities, and let's go back to physical risks, because it's usually more challenging for people. If there's no physical risk in the environment, we always talk about children should be able to problem solve. Solve what? What are they solving if the risk is not there for them first to be able to identify, make an active decision about, and come up with a solution? So we need to be able to risk detect. We need what first? A risk that can be identified, and those decisions can be made. Without that capacity, you're really setting people up, human beings, up for failure in their adolescent years, when they're no longer, hey, wow, they're not our responsibility anymore, right? Well, I'd say wrong. The average educator or play worker has children potentially for 7 years in their care in some of the most formative developmental periods of their life, in this realm, which these huge capacities are developed. And we have to take that very seriously. Now, as play workers, this is another one of those words that gets used mutually exclusively, like leisure and play. But we very, very clearly delineate the difference between a hazard and a risk. So as play workers, we're very active and proactive in mitigating and removing hazards. You can't completely do it, because that's a godly gift to be able to identify every single possible hazard in the world. But we look at the environment and we consider what are hazards. And the difference between a risk and a hazard is quite simply, a hazard is a risk that children won't have the opportunity to identify and make a decision about themselves. So risks remain, hazards are ideally removed. But risk management, risk mitigation, once again, I know I'm harping on now, but it's so obvious when you think about it this way. How can we ever make decisions about these things if we are never exposed to an opportunity to do so?
And just the skills some kids are missing. Like, I know I've seen kids we've had in year 5 and year 6 that still couldn't really identify if something was heavy or hot, or because they've just never been around those type of risks or had the opportunity to do it themselves. But that's like 10 to 12-year-olds. They should be able to identify that. And it's almost like you're doing a negative for them, never allowing them to have any, I guess, insight into it. It's like even fire play. Like, I always wanted fire play, but we had a lot of setback from the school because we're on school grounds. I think they're still working on it. That's the other thing, keep persisting, keep going to the school with more and more information. But then that's just a way they can realize something that's hot, what to do with it, how close they can get, what it does. Like, they'll see it actually move, how it moves the wood and burns the wood, or if anyone's got a marshmallow, what happens to that. I feel like that all helps with their own understanding of
it. Does, Barbie, and you articulated that really well. And just without going too much down a philosophical rabbit hole here, in a few of our Ds we talk about this idea of a Peresovane moment. Now, Peresovane is a concept that Lev Vygotsky came up with before he died. So most people know Lev Vygotsky because of his zone of proximal development, if you're studying educational psychology. But Peresovane literally translates into lived experience. In the Western world, we can, this idea of Peresovane has been heavily simplified, and you see posters on classroom walls that say stuff like, your learning occurs in an optimal state when learning is a joy. And that's not wrong, but Lev actually talked about this idea of learning being more amazing and optimal when there was an emotional connection to the learning. And joy is only one emotional connection. Frustration, a bit of fear, a bit of anger, a bit of love, a bit of challenge. A lot of play is done with red faces and grit teeth. It doesn't always occur with a big smile, holding hands and skipping. But there's an emotional connection is what's important. Now, I use that concept of Peresovane, Barbie, with fire all the time, because we want children to be able to handle real elemental risks. For some reason, we're really logical about that in the world with swimming. It's a really dangerous thing. So we teach kids to swim early, period. Very smart, very sensible. And then we don't do the same thing with a lot of other elemental risks. Now, with fire, you can teach kids all you want about it on an interactive whiteboard. You can have a picture of a fire, you can explain that it's hot, you can explain how wind is dangerous when fire's happening, and it won't mean anything because it's not a lived experience. There's nothing greater than getting kids around a fire in a circle. There's radiant heat, you can feel it, you can smell it, you can actually hear fire. Sometimes we don't even think of that, but there's those crackling, beautiful sounds. It smells. So there's all these other sensory inputs that create the emotions that connect you with that space and that time. And that's where I'm not fixated on learning. I like play for play's sake, but we can't deny that there's amazing learning happening in those spaces with those lived experiences, and lived experiences specifically with emotional connections. Now, that's one example that's obviously a bit profound, and it shouldn't be, but let's face it, when you say fire and OSH, a lot of people raise their eyebrows. But I want to get everyone just to ponder for a second how many of those emotional connections would occur daily in a play space that's richly afforded, that's very, very well crafted, that children are allowed to interact with freely, and the environment will interact with them in turn. There are just thousands of these emotional connections happening on any given day. If those connections can be intrinsically motivated, because we lose it when it's the activity we had to do on Thursday, sort of thing.
Activity we have to do on Thursday. I liked how in the past you've mentioned that risks leads to problem solving if we engaged with it. Then we mentioned about social and emotional risks, that they are involved in seemingly no physical risk activity. They're still social emotional risk. And now I'm seeing how learning how to swim, playing with fire, these are emotional engagement, fear of dying, and I can tell you all about it because I didn't learn swimming as a child. So as an adult, I'm like, I'm going to die. So these emotional engagement, I was so involved when I was learning swimming. I was like, every part of my body was involved because there was an emotional charge to learn that. And there was a huge risk of dying in it. So, and what I really enjoyed when he said, well, we learned swimming as a child because it is an identified life skill. And then why not with fire around us? There's fire around us at all times. So why not have some sort of play around that and let them have risk and solve it?
Saurabh, you've touched on another really interesting point there, which is that I'll go back to that word perception. And this is another part where the perception of play is really important, because people, when they make subjective decisions about what is good and bad in play, speak like they are announcing something that's globally understood. But you raised a good point, and you've told me your story before about learning to swim as an adult because there just weren't swimming pools or safe places to swim where you lived and where you grew up. And that's sort of a cultural perception of swimming there is just very different maybe than the perception of swimming in Southeast Queensland. But those cultural perceptions don't even need to be from Australia to India. They can be from OSH to OSH. That's how amazing it is. Another amazing OSH that we're lucky enough to do a lot of work with is Mooloolaba OSH on the Sunshine Coast in Australia.
Yeah, been there too,
Yeah, and just to articulate how different culture can be in not such a different geographical area. The team at Mooloolaba do amazing things and are huge advocates for children and their play. Can't compliment them enough. And they had visited Camp Hill several times, and they were wanting to do fire as well. So Barbie, you can probably relate to this story. And they had all the right intentions, all the right risk-benefit plans. It would have been absolutely great. But as a society and a culture, the stakeholders of that particular community couldn't get on board. They still saw it as a risk, even though we supported them all we could. And that's fine, because we also can't tick off our stakeholders too much. So there has to be some give and take there. But Mooloolaba OSH do surfing once a week.
Yeah.
So they've got kids in the surf, the open ocean, surfing, because at Mooloolaba, that's just what kids do, right? And in Camp Hill, like, you wouldn't, the idea of taking 12 kids in the surf by yourself without the training seems so much hectically more risky than a little campfire that you can perfectly control and manage. But it's just the cultural perception there. For them, from Mooloolabah's culture, surfing, whatever, we do it every day. For us, the fire, and it just didn't correlate. When I was doing our regional road trip last year, we were talking about rough and tumble play with a service in Kingaroy, and the children there, their rough and tumble play usually forms around the narrative of pig hunting. And a couple of kids play the dogs, a couple of kids play the pigs. There's the hunters, and they chase each other down until they can tackle them and stick the pig sticking. And I'm just like, wow, okay, we don't see a lot of that in Camp Hill. So it's actually amazing how culture feeds very directly into the play frame, but not only into the play frame, but in how the surrounding stakeholders view that and the appropriate nature or not of the play itself.
I guess it's important to keep building on this. I don't want to even use risky play like you said before, but risky play, like although we weren't allowed to do fire, over the years, what we were able to gradually do, just built and built, like, because we were in a school that the children aren't allowed to run on the asphalt, one of those no handstand cartwheels. But for us, we argued like the ratio is lower, how supervised activities are and all that different type of thing, and the training people had. So we managed to get in tree climbing, although teachers didn't like it, but the principal just having those conversations explaining, they let us do that. Loose parts play over time was allowed to get bigger and bigger, and I gather it's even bigger now. So it's almost like those little baby steps of keep advocating, I guess, for the play in your service. You may get a no, but it doesn't mean you can't keep trying or try and have other avenues. Or for me, it was just the stakeholders change too. So it's adapting to those stakeholders. If you have a parent committee, they change over the years, even the families you've got. I know the families I had from 2010 to 2020 were completely different. So there, like, I have to admit, the 2010 families were like, yeah, my kid can do whatever. So it got a lot different over the next 10 years. And just keep having a go.
And also we as an individual change, Barbi, isn't it? I mean, 10 years ago, talking about play or children's psychology or behavior engagement, I think 2 years ago I was speaking in a different manner than I do now. I guess this continuous development and the community we have. So you mentioned Mooloolaba, Grand Avenue, Camp Hill, Barbi's service, and I've been fortunate to have been to all these for after school care. So I'm really glad that I've been there. But this is this community, because Angus goes out and does research and then shares things with us, and the same with Mooloolaba. I've seen their posts up, and this is so important that we are always growing, because we keep changing, and there's different things that we can go back to the stakeholders, ever-changing stakeholders. I understand, ever-changing parents, but we can stay consistent and say, hey, look, I've just learned something more, which might tip the favor to our side or something.
Because they're also learning themselves. Like, they might be doing their own professional development on the school side. Like, I know for me, I had 4 different principals, so it was always just a constant re-educating or giving them that insight, or even letting them see it. So tree climbing just sounds like a straight no, but showing them, well, this is a tree. They wanted us to put a certain height on it. This is the height, but like, it was just those baby steps letting us into it. And the principal's, oh yeah, that's tree's fine. Like, but if we were just in his office, he'd be like, no, not doing that. Whereas just seeing it physically in front of him, like it wasn't that high. It's a safe tree. It's where, again, like, kids get to learn those risks, or how to identify risks. Like this, they'll be able to tell their own body weight on a branch and whether they should step onto that. Whereas if they never did that, they would never know. Like, it's just
100% lived experience right there.
Yeah. And I know you said you didn't like using the term learning, but play is learning, I guess. Like, you're learning through doing it all. But not looking at it with,
There's a great quote around that, and it's in play, children learn how to learn.
Right.
So I quite like that.
Yeah, because in the moment up a tree, like, for example, they have to decide where they put their hand, their foot. Like, usually there won't be someone telling them. It's them, how they feel of how that branch feels, if they can do it, if they can reach, because the kid next to them could have longer limbs and can do it differently. Whereas when you're sitting in a classroom with like A, B, C, and D, you can kind of see it. So it's such a different learning experience. And like I said, they learn to learn on their own.
A real life example, just a couple of days ago, a friend of mine invited me to rock climbing. And she said, if you want to problem solve with your body, And when it's like, oh, you can do some problem solving with your body, come to rock climbing. I'm like, oh, that's a really different way to look at it. And when Angus mentioned about problem solving in terms of risk and problem solving, like, oh, this is exactly what happened with me a couple of days ago. And I just keep saying that, yes, adult logic is very different to kids' logic, but to someone who is aware, as you mentioned Izzy's name, how self-aware and awareness, if you were to bring awareness and become conscious of things you do, you can see so many parallels. Like, okay, I am problem solving using my body with rock climbing or indoor climbing, sorry, that was. And how can I provide these opportunities to children? It may not look like rock climbing, but it could look like some different ways of problem solving.
You're right. And I think, so to do that is I don't want to say, no, it's not right to say that it's easier than it seems, but it's often different than it seems. So providing opportunities, once again, there can be our agenda slapped on that. We've already pointed out here, you were talking about problem solving. Now, to go back to that idea before about risk detection, what do we need first to be able to solve a problem? The problem. So we need the problem. Now, what we find when we create amazing play spaces for children, and play spaces offered with a playworker's level of affordance, is that children aren't only great at problem solving, they're great at problem creation, because that's interesting. Children will go out and actually create the very problem that they're going to solve. But because we're not dictating that, they usually do set it at a challenging enough zone, but solvable, because that's fun. It's not fun if you can never actually get to the and that's sort of the motivation there. But they will play at the edge of that fun, which means it also doesn't always go right, because we also learn a lot from our mistakes as much as we do our successes. In fact, probably more in some situations. But that, once again, and I use this analogy, and this is tying together a few ideas here. Sorry, my brain's going all over. But Barbie, you mentioned the children in the tree, and one's got different arms than the other. So what I'm getting at here from an OSH perspective, or, you know what, once again, a working with children perspective, how do you program tree climbing or that learning experience for that child when every single child in your service has a different length arm? So we can't do that. But what we can do is provide the space, the time, the resources for the children to set their problem creation where they're at, where they're able, from 5-year-olds to 12-year-olds in an OSH setting, and they can actually set that bar appropriately. And they do, because evolution has designed us to do that when given the space and time, and taking off the, adulterating sort of view of the very well-meaning adult often that's in that space, seeking to find those outcomes for the children, when really they're hardwired to actually try to find it for themselves.
I like it. I love it again. It says, what I wrote is problem solving, but don't have to necessarily go and create problems. They'll create their own problems.
Absolutely.
and a problem that they think that they can solve also. They play at the edge of it.
Usually. And I will suggest that if we don't allow them to create problems like that, which the way that I explain that sounds like very desirable problems that we want children to be solving, they're going to do it anyway. They're just going to be problems that vex the educators, because it's not that they're being, inverted commas, naughty children, but they're hardwired to do this. It's pushing the boundaries. It's playing with the edge of their current knowledge. It fits into so many educational paradigms, from Piaget or whatever you want. Like, we need to play with the edges of our current knowledge, extrapolate it, break it down, go through disequilibrium before we reconstitute those ideas into a solid thought. But if we're not allowed to play with the boundaries or push them, we're not going to get to those really important growth zones.
I felt like you were describing my 2-year-old toddler. I
think he's describing a lot of kids here, and it's a voice for the children. Thank you, Angus. You mentioned Piaget's work on, and I always quote him by saying the conflict is good. Conflict is not always bad. Stress is good. Sometimes stress is really good. It's how you perceive stress, and of course we're not going to go into it, but it's going to be a different podcast altogether of how these childhood problem solving, social, emotional, physical, cognitive, all these developmental domains of problem solving leads to then holistic growth in an individual as an adult when they see stress and they have a different narrative towards stress.
And even resilience.
Yeah, exactly.
I think it all adds to resilience building, and I think there's a big kind of gap there. Like I have to even admit, at the moment, I had quite a different background, childhood growing up, so been through everything and all that. But I'm in Sydney, and I was saying before, I don't know how many weeks of lockdown. I'm actually fine. I mean, I do care, but I don't care. I'm safe. I've got somewhere to live. I've got food. Like those things I didn't always have as a child. So it's like kind of resilience building now. I know it's a bit different to everyone else's, but just even the little day-to-day things people have to get through, all these little resilient building things they go through childhood, even if it's you playing with a fire, you accidentally get burnt, it adds to it. I think it all helps with where they're going and where they're going to be as they get older, especially with all the brain development that starts going on in the later teen years. Decision making, there's the other end of the risky decision making too. So
yeah, resilience is a funny one, Barb, because like, I mean, it's a challenging one because you don't want to sort of patronize people who are really struggling with resilience, but at the same time, resilience is another example of one of those things, kind of like the ability to, for the ability to detect risk, you need the risk in the first place. Like we can't develop resilience without understanding what we're developing it to counter, if that makes sense. And Sarah mentioned that, you know, conflict can be good, and absolutely, and there's conflict in play all the time. And it's not to say that we never would intervene when that gets a little bit too, well, depending on the context of the play and the children involved. And we know, you know, everyone knows their children better than anyone else, but a level of conflict to be able to navigate through is very important. And that could be a very intrinsically motivated level of conflict that children have added to a play frame, because that's the challenge they're seeking that day. That's the boundary they're pushing and extrapolating. It's not to say it's easy, by the way. It can actually be really challenging as a practitioner to observe and understand that. But what you don't want is 12-year-olds who have never learnt how to handle a conflict.
Yeah, because there's enough 20, 25, 30, 35-year-olds that are like that. I myself, I'm not actually that great with conflict.
For me, it depends upon the conflict.
I may be fine with resilience, but conflict in me, I'm like, nope, I'll go hide.
Angus, you know, I'm looking at my notes and really going through, and you know, we thought we will go in tangent but for me, things keep coming back to this understanding children, understanding play and children's play, and trust, ego, like having trust in them and letting our ego be on the side for a few minutes and really trusting it and letting go of that control.
And so there's a great, sorry, you know, I love quotes, but there's a brilliant quote by John Holt on this area, which is effectively so many of us as adults don't feel like we can trust children, and that's because as children we were taught we couldn't be trusted. And that's just such a vicious cycle there to really critically reflect on as an educator. What about play aren't we trusting? How were we made to feel when we were playing? What was considered naughty? What was considered taboo? All these different ideas that we can use in our critical reflection to come back to. And you said before, understanding play, and I love that. And I think a play worker's aim is to understand play, but there's also got to be that existential kind of acceptance of we're not always going to understand it either. It's way too complex for that. To go back to the Gordon Starrett quote as well, it's too big for that. No matter how hard we think about it objectively, we slip back into the subjective realm of what we're trying to understand, and it's very, very tricky. But the most knowledge that we can have, the broadest understanding we can have, the most diverse understanding of it we can have, allows us to respect it and allow it to occur. And it's, you know, pretty amazing to watch when we come from it from that angle.
It's like you can love without necessarily understanding every bit of it. Like even when we love someone, like love a dog, love your parents, you don't understand all of it. You sometimes say, I just don't get my dad, man, but I love him. You don't have to necessarily understand every bit of it. That's beautifully put, Angus. That was really nice in terms of really understanding that, you know, we don't this trust thing. This is like uncertainty. People like certainty. So if we know what's going to happen, then we'll be happy. But this continuous exploration of playwork practices seems to be, for me, seems to be in a way that allows children to have those times where they can choose what they want and be engaged in it because they chose it and they're intensely motivated and they keep creating conflicts within it. The challenge is to solve them, and it's all depends upon what are you observing for. Are you observing observation wise? When I look at people observing, they say, different stages of observation. That's how I put it. But then there are people who would observe those small things. Say, I saw this happen, or I saw this happen, and I'm excited about that. This is now possible in my after school care or long day care or educational body, whatever that is. Because if you know more, you observe more, kind of thing. Now, you know what to observe for. If you don't 100%. Know those things, you may not be able to. The great things might be happening in front of you, and you may not have anything to write in critical reflection or observation because you may say, nothing happened. Kids were just sitting down and doing nothing. Whereas it could have been a beautiful thing might have happened, but it's just that we didn't know how to perhaps observe it or what to write about it. So this knowledge and information, and I hope that this podcast gives people these inquiries that they can engage themselves in, and perhaps accrue knowledge, and by all means get in touch with us and ask your questions, and we'd like to answer that and have Angus again to our podcast. So
love to come.
I just wanted to say something quickly there because I hear it a lot when you just said something about nothing happened.
Yeah.
But if you feel nothing happened and you have 100 kids, doesn't that mean that play is actually genuinely happening? If none of those children needed anything from you for that afternoon, because we've had that happen with 150, I feel like then actually a lot was happening.
Yes.
Sorry, just to throw a spanner in.
No, this is great. So this is exactly, but Angus, we covered a lot of things, and at the beginning of it, we were thinking, hopefully we don't go into tangents. But I'm thinking, let's go all tangents possible because this is brilliant. And we also were thinking before we recorded this podcast, can our podcast go for 2 hours? And I think I would love to hear what the community has to say about this, and any questions they might have around play, or what sort of things can they take to their stakeholders, because they might be wanting to do all of this. They might want some training from Angus. Also, we will link those things into this descriptions, and perhaps and then have those things. I was about to say organize those things, but then I realized, hang on, I'm just mixing those ideologies of organizing this, because if you organize it, you actually are fighting against the same thing which you are saying. So, but yeah, letting go of things. Let's put it this way, and how to best let it go. So thank you very much, Angus, for all there is. But is there anything, Angus, that you want to say more to one or a couple of things that you wanted to say more to people who might be interested in learning more about Playwork?
Once again, tangent time. No, look, I think it's a journey and it has to start somewhere. So start small. I think probably the biggest piece of advice I give these days is that we do get a lot of visitors to our play space, and a lot of people love it. It can aesthetically challenge people too. Let's not sugarcoat everything. There's a lot of conversations to be had about the appearance of both the physical environment and even the practice that exists in it, although most people can't deny that there's a lack of behavior management. Children are engaged, they're happy, they're doing amazing stuff. So it's usually an interesting dynamic to watch. But our play space didn't happen after we made a decision on a Friday, and then by Monday it was all guns blazing, so to speak. It was a story, it was a journey, and I wouldn't even recommend trying to do it over a weekend, because I can honestly say that the worst practitioners in a very well facilitated playwork environment are counterintuitive to the journey, because they're going to be more anxious, and they're not enjoying their practice, and they're more likely to then intervene in play unnecessarily, etc., etc., etc. So start small, upskill yourself, read. There's a lot of information out there. I said earlier that this is not some niche new age movement. There's decades and decades and decades full of amazing research, PhDs, books, papers, blogs, you name it, specific to playwork and playwork practice. The evidence base is there. We don't need to create it from scratch. We can refine and learn more always. We don't need to make it up. It's there. And if we can start looking at that stuff, it's the start of the journey, to be honest with you. Another one of the Playwork principles is the fact that playworkers base their practice on the most sound and up-to-date knowledge. And to me, that's a really beautiful sentiment, because it suggests that it's not about doing a certificate or a diploma and then assuming that you've got all the knowledge you'll ever need to do that job. It's an obligation to constantly learn more, to constantly put yourself out there, to critique your own practice, to devil's advocate it, to reflect and then critically reflect with others. And through this process, we start to get a little bit more of a handle on this very, very blurry thing, this very, very hard to understand thing called play.
And when you listen to the same thing 2 years from now, 2 months from now, you learn different things from the same thing. It's watching the same movie once in a couple of years gives you different messages. So it reminded me of something which we used to do in science when we worked in science, and it was CDSU. We used to say it was current, dominant, scientific understanding. So it was, the 4 words were said in a different in these ways for a reason. So it was current. It was just the dominant, not the truth. It's just the dominant, and it's current, and it's just a scientific understanding. There could be alternate understanding as well, and it's just an understanding, not a fact. So it was CDSU, and when you mentioned something about how it's not about just going and getting a certificate and then saying, okay, from now on I can preach this for the rest of my life, but rather this is just the beginning. And you mentioned take small steps. And I was wondering, Angus, to get in touch with you for people who are listening to this and they might have some questions around this, Outsiders Play Advocate Facebook page, would that be the best way to get in touch?
That's an option. Probably just the Outsiders Play Advocates at gmail.com would be easy as well. Happy to answer and entertain any questions or inquiries that come through there, obviously. But check out our page. It sort of gives you a pretty good idea of who we're working with and what we're doing in those spaces that we're working. Not a bad place to start anyway.
It motivated me, like on my small journey from starting. And like you said, don't go all in. Just do baby steps, and it's important having those educators on board. I know I mentioned tree climbing, but we only had the educators that were comfortable supervising that on that activity as well. So
I'm sure my boy Callum was one of them.
Yeah. Oh gosh.
Let's give him a shout out. Come on.
Yeah. Okay. Well, he's one that pressed me for it because I was the nominated supervisor, so I got all the backlash. But he's the voice of the children and the educational leader at the time, and he's the one prostrate me.
Advocating the play agenda over the adults. Beautiful.
Yeah, but needed that and as well. And then like it was just over those times and stakeholders just getting there. And like I said, because I had a toddler and I've left, but I'm sure they've made so much process without me there, and because of him.
And one thing I always ask in my sessions also when I talk about play, that what are we doing as adults to play? As in what motivates us to do things, and because more of that play in our own lives would allow us to perhaps then see when kids are playing and observe it, like, this is fun, this is joy, this is how it looks like. But if you don't play, then I'm not sure how we can provide, not provide, that's a different word. I'm not going to say the word provide, but how can we enable or even observe when play is happening in front of us? So,
Look, I feel like I never grew up, so I genuinely love play. Like, I think I missed out a lot of childhood though. So I'm like one of those movie scenarios where I'm just stuck in childhood. But I think that's besides being scared of the risk, I think that's what made me a great educator though in the same time.
Well, thank you very much, Angus. And as you know, that you can contact Angus on Facebook pages Outsiders Play Advocates, if I'm not wrong, and the Gmail address is outsidersplayaadvocate@gmail.com.
The Outsiders Play Advocates at gmail.com.
We'll put it all in links too.
We'll just write this up.
Yeah.
And we also would write down those 8 principles of playwork practice. Which
I'll send you through some resources once we sign off.
thank you very much for those who are listening. We love your support. When our podcast is delayed, we do get these inquiries as to say, when is the next one coming up? And which tells us that there are people who listen to this. So thank you very much, Angus, for making this one of the best conversations I've had about play. So I learned a lot. I'm very fortunate that I get to learn these things from the experts. And thanks, Barbi, again for your contribution and for organizing this the third time. So,
I think this is Angus actually is organizing.
That's nice. That's nice.
We'll just say Angus.
And you can support us by liking our page, OSH After the Bell podcast. We Belong Education is where I'm from, and Firefly HR for Barbi. Thank you very much for listening. Have a wonderful day. Thank you, Angus, for being here. And have a lovely day, Barbi. And
thank you.
Talk soon, everyone.